The scratching begins just after midnight, when the blizzard rages at its worst. Ivory stirs a pot of venison stew over the fire, trying to ignore the howling wind that makes the wooden walls creak and groan, threatening to collapse at any moment. 3 years she'd lived in this isolated cabin. 3 years of solitude and silence, broken only by nature's sounds and her own voice when loneliness demanded she speak just to remember human speech. The scratching grows louder, more insistent, accompanied by a low whine cutting through the storm. Ivory freezes, wooden spoon halfway to her mouth. Her heart pounds, threatening to escape her chest. Outside, nothing ever came here. Isolation was her choice. Walked into the mountains for 2 weeks after being cast out by her pack, seeking a place so remote she could never hurt anyone again. The scratching turns to heavy, rhythmic thuds against the door. Something big is out there. Ivory sets down her spoon with trembling hands and approaches the door. Her pale fingers brush the rough wood. Her breath fogs in the freezing air seeping through the cracks. She was terrified, yet something deep inside stirred, the healer in her drawn to the desperate sound, a part that 3 years of solitude couldn't kill. Every instinct screams to stay inside, let it freeze or leave. But Ivory knows right and safe aren't always the same. 3 years of punishing herself for deaths that may not have been her fault flash in her mind. The bolt slides back with a metallic click, impossibly loud. The door swings open, and Ivory stumbles back as a wave of snow wind, and something massive bursts inside. 12 white wolves flood the cabin, enormous and covered in ice, pressing her against the far wall. The largest wolves she'd ever seen, each twice the size of a normal wolf, with thick white fur glowing in the dim firelight. Their eyes were various shades of blue and silver, pale and striking. They all watched her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. These weren't ordinary wolves. They were shifters. They had to be. No natural animal moved with such coordinated purpose. No natural animal looked at you with such calculating awareness. But they weren't shifting to human form, which meant they either couldn't or wouldn't, and Ivory didn't know which possibility scared her more. The largest wolf, a massive beast with ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her soul, moved forward slowly. He was at least 4 feet tall at the shoulder, with a thick mane of fur around his neck and a bearing that screamed alpha even in his animal form. He stopped 3 feet from her and sat, his gaze never leaving hers, waiting. The others arranged themselves around the room, shaking off snow and ice, their movements controlled despite their obvious exhaustion. Ivory pressed herself harder against the wall, her mind racing. She should be terrified. She should be screaming or fighting or doing something other than standing frozen like prey. But looking at these magnificent creatures, seeing the exhaustion in their eyes, and the way they trembled from cold despite their thick winter coats, all she could think about was that they were dying. They'd been caught in the blizzard, had somehow made it to her cabin, and if she turned them away, they'd freeze to death within the hour. She'd already caused enough death for 1 lifetime. Ivory's own curse had started innocently enough. She'd been 21 when Marcus, a young alpha from her pack, had fallen in love with her despite her strange appearance. She'd been born different, that was clear from the moment she took her first breath. Pure white hair, skin so pale it was almost translucent, eyes the color of ice, and a small frame even for an omega. Her mother had died during childbirth, and her father, unable to look at the daughter who'd cost him his mate, had drunk himself to death before Ivory turned 2. She'd been raised by her grandmother, a tough old wolf who loved her fiercely but had always warned her that being different came with a price. Marcus hadn't cared about her appearance. He'd loved her wit, her kindness, her skill with healing herbs, and her gentle way with wounded animals. When he'd asked her to be his mate, she'd said yes without hesitation, thinking maybe finally she'd found someone who saw past her cursive appearance to the person underneath. The mocking ceremony had been beautiful. Marcus had bitten her neck gently, making the bond that would tie them together for life. Ivory had felt the connection snap into place, warm and perfect, everything she'd ever dreamed of. They'd celebrated with the pack, made love in their new home, fallen asleep wrapped in each other's arms. Marcus had been dead by morning. The pack healers said it was a heart attack, sudden and violent, impossible to predict. But Ivory had seen the way people looked at her at his funeral, the whispers that followed her everywhere, the pale Omega and her marked mate, dead before the bond could even settle. It was unnatural, cursed. She'd grieved alone, devastated and confused, wondering if she'd somehow caused it. Yet the rational part of her mind insisted it was just terrible timing, a tragedy, but not her fault. Hearts failed sometimes. People died. It wasn't her curse. Then Cain had insisted on courting her. Cain was a beta, solid and kind, Marcus' best friend. He told Ivory he didn't believe in curses, that Marcus' death was just bad luck, and she deserved a second chance at happiness. She'd resisted for 6 months, terrified of losing someone else. But Cain had been persistent and gentle, and eventually she'd given in. The marking ceremony was smaller this time, more private, just a few witnesses instead of the whole pack. Cain had marked her at sunset, and they'd spent the night in his cabin, Ivory trying to silence the voice in her head that kept whispering this was a mistake. Cain had been dead by dawn. Heart attack, the healers said again, 2 days after marking Ivory. That's when the pack had turned on her completely. The pale widow they'd called her, Death's bride, cursed by the moon goddess to kill any male who tried to claim her. The Alpha had given her a choice: leave voluntarily or be executed as a threat to the pack. She'd left that same day, walking into the mountains with nothing but a pack of supplies and the clothes on her back, determined to die alone rather than kill anyone else. But she hadn't died. She'd survived, found this cabin, learned to live in total isolation, and had been alone ever since, convincing herself it was better this way. Safer. The only way to protect anyone from the curse she carried. Now these 12 wolves were in her cabin, their eyes on her, their lives in her hands. If they were shifters and they marked her, they'd die. But they were in wolf form, which meant marking wasn't an option, and maybe, just maybe, she could help them survive the blizzard without anyone else dying because of her. The decision made itself. Ivory took a shaking breath and moved slowly away from the wall, keeping her movements careful and non-threatening. The big Alpha's eyes tracked her, but he didn't move, just watched as she retrieved her medical supplies from the cabinet near the door. She spent the next hour checking each wolf for injuries, her gentle hands running through thick white fur, searching for wounds or signs of frostbite. Most were just exhausted and cold, but 3 had minor injuries from what looked like a rock slide, deep gashes that needed cleaning and binding. 2 showed signs of severe hypothermia despite their thick coats, their breathing too shallow and their heartbeats too slow. The rest were simply pushed beyond their limits, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Ivory worked methodically, falling into the familiar rhythm of healing she'd learned from her grandmother. She cleaned wounds with warm water and her precious store of antiseptic herbs, applied salves to fight infection and speed recovery, and used strips of cloth to bind the worst gashes. She built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, knowing the wolves needed heat to recover. She fed them her entire pot of stew and most of her dried meat, watching them eat with the efficiency of trained soldiers who'd learned to take sustenance whenever it was offered. Through it all, the big Alpha never left her side. He followed her from wolf to wolf, watching her work with those intense ice-blue eyes, and whenever she moved back toward the fire, he was right there, a massive warm presence just behind her. The other wolves seemed to take their cues from him, relaxing as he relaxed, accepting her touch because he deemed her safe. By the time she'd finished treating everyone, Ivory was exhausted, and the blizzard outside had intensified to the point where she couldn't see more than a foot beyond the windows. Snow piled against the cabin walls, the wind screaming like something alive and angry. They'd be trapped here for days at least, maybe a week if the storm kept up. She looked at the 12 enormous wolves sprawled around her small cabin, taking up every available inch of floor space, and felt a laugh bubble up in her throat. It came out half hysterical, tinged with exhaustion and the surreal absurdity of her situation. 3 years of isolation, and now her cabin was full of the biggest wolves she'd ever seen, all watching her with disturbingly intelligent eyes. The Alpha made a sound almost like a chuckle, a huffing noise that made his whole body shake. Then he moved to the rug in front of the fire and laid down, his massive head resting on his paws. The others followed his lead, arranging themselves around the room in a loose pack formation. 2 of the smaller ones curled up together near the door, 3 claimed the space beneath the window, and the rest spread out across the remaining floor space, all settling in like they'd done this 1,000 times before. Ivory stood in the middle of her now crowded cabin, feeling more confused than scared. She probably should have been terrified, wondering what would happen if they shifted back to human form. But looking at these magnificent creatures, seeing them relax and begin to drift toward sleep, all she felt was a strange sense of rightness, like something missing had suddenly clicked into place. She was too tired to analyze it. She banked the fire, wrapped herself in her warmest blanket, and climbed into her small bed in the corner of the cabin. The big Alpha immediately rose and padded over, settling himself on the floor right next to her bed, his massive body a warm barrier between her and the rest of the pack. Ivory reached down without thinking and buried her fingers in his thick fur, marveling at how soft it was despite looking coarse. The wolf made a rumbling sound of contentment and pressed closer to her touch. Ivory fell asleep with her hands still tangled in white fur, feeling safer than she had in 3 years. She woke to find the cabin warmer and the storm still raging outside. Gray morning light filtered through the ice-covered windows, illuminating her unusual house guests. Most of the wolves were still sleeping, their exhausted bodies sprawled in ungainly positions that would have been funny if they weren't also somewhat majestic. The Alpha was awake, his ice-blue eyes watching her with an intensity that should have been unnerving, but somehow wasn't. Ivory carefully extracted herself from her blankets and set about making breakfast. She had enough supplies for maybe a week if rationed carefully, which meant feeding 12 enormous wolves would deplete her stores faster than she liked. But she couldn't let them starve. And besides, once the storm passed, they'd probably leave, and she'd be alone again. She could worry about restocking then. She made a massive pot of oatmeal mixed with dried berries and honey, using up most of her grain stores in one go. The wolves woke one by one as the smell of food filled the cabin, stretching, yawning, and looking around with alert eyes. They ate the oatmeal from the bowls she set out, their table manners surprisingly good for animals, and Ivory found herself watching them with fascination. They really were beautiful. Their white fur was thick and luxurious, unmarred by any darker colors. Their eyes ranged from pale blue to deep sapphire to silver gray, each set unique and striking. They moved with coordinated grace even in the cramped space, never bumping into each other or her, always aware of exactly where everyone was. Military precision in wolf form. The second day passed in a strange domestic rhythm.
窗体顶端
Ivory checked their wounds and was pleased to see them healing faster than normal, confirming they were shifters with enhanced healing. She talked to them as she worked, her voice filling the silence she'd kept for 3 years. She told them about her grandmother's healing techniques, about the herbs she grew in the summer months, and about the strange peace she'd found in isolation. She didn't tell them about her curse, didn't mention Marcus or Cain, or the reason she lived alone. That was her burden to carry, and they'd be gone soon anyway. The wolves listened with remarkable attention. They couldn't talk back, couldn't shift to human form for reasons she didn't understand, but they were clearly intelligent. They brought her firewood from the covered pile outside, taking turns braving the brutal storm to drag logs back. They arranged themselves to help conserve heat, their large bodies acting as living barriers against the cold air that seeped through the cabin's walls. The Alpha stayed by her side constantly, his presence both protective and oddly comforting. By the 3rd day, Ivory had started naming them in her head. She couldn't help it. They had such distinct personalities that she couldn't keep thinking of them as just wolves. The Alpha she called Frost, both for his coloring and the icy intensity of his gaze. The 2 who always curled up together she named Snow and Ice, a bonded pair who moved like they shared one mind. The 3 near the window became Dawn, Mist, and Cloud. The others were Storm, Winter, North, Silver, Pale, and Ghost. She knew it was dangerous to name them. Naming meant attachment, and attachment meant pain when they left. But she couldn't stop herself. For 3 days these wolves had been her only company, and despite the circumstances, despite the strangeness of it all, she'd felt less lonely than she had in years. On the 4th morning, Ivory woke to silence. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. Brilliant sunshine streamed through the windows, making the snow outside sparkle like diamonds. It was beautiful and terrible because it meant her guests would be leaving. She sat up in bed and found the cabin empty except for Frost, who was sitting exactly where he'd been when she fell asleep, watching her with those unervingly intelligent eyes. Her heart clenched. They were already gone. All of them except the Alpha. And he'd probably leave too once he was sure she was all right. Ivory forced herself out of bed, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders against the lingering cold. She didn't look at Frost as she moved to the window, staring out at the pristine snowscape. The storm had dumped at least 4 feet of new snow, drifting even higher where the wind had piled it against trees and rocks. It would take days to dig out, and her path to the nearest trading post was completely buried. She heard movement behind her and turned to see Frost rising and padding toward the door. This was it. He was leaving. She'd be alone again. Ivory forced herself to smile, to act like she was fine, like she hadn't spent 3 days pretending these wolves were her pack. But Frost didn't scratch at the door to be let out. Instead, he sat facing it and made a low chuffing sound. Almost immediately, the door swung open and 12 men walked in. All of them completely naked and absolutely stunning. Ivory's blanket slipped from her fingers. They were tall, easily over 6 feet, with muscular builds that spoke of years of warrior training. Their hair ranged from platinum to white blonde, and their eyes held the same striking shades she'd seen in wolf form. But it was the man in front who stole her breath, who made her heart stutter and her wolf howl in recognition deep inside her mind. He was the most beautiful man she had ever seen. Platinum blonde hair fell in thick waves to his shoulders. His face was all sharp angles and clean lines, with a jaw that looked carved from stone and lips that were both severe and soft. His body was pure strength, broad shoulders, a narrow waist, long legs. And his eyes, those ice-blue eyes, were locked on her with an intensity that made her knees threaten to give way. He was also the Alpha she'd been calling Frost, now in human form, kneeling naked in her doorway. The man spoke, his voice deep and rich, touched with an accent she couldn't place. "My name is Kristoff, Alpha King of the Northern Crown Pack. These are my elite guard. You saved our lives when you could have left us to freeze. You fed us when you barely had enough for yourself. You healed our wounds and kept us warm and asked for nothing in return. By the laws of the moon goddess and the rights of my position, I claim you as my intended mate and ask for your hand in joining with me to rule my pack as my Luna and Queen." Ivory stared at him, her mind refusing to accept the words she was hearing. Alpha King, elite guard, intended mate, Luna. None of it made sense, not in relation to her, not in any world that obeyed logic. "I can't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. I can't be anyone's mate. I can't mark or be marked. I'll kill you." Kristoff rose in one smooth, powerful motion, and Ivory had to fight the instinct to retreat. He was so big, so intense, so impossibly male, standing there utterly unashamed in her small cabin. He approached slowly, like calming a frightened animal, his hands lifted in a peaceful gesture. "I know about your curse," he said softly. "I know about Marcus and Cain. I know what your pack called you and why you ran." Kristoff's touch was warm against her cold skin, steady in a way that quieted the storm still raging inside her. "You won't kill me," he said softly, but with the certainty of a man who'd built his entire life on instinct and truth. "Our bond is the one your soul has been waiting for. The only one it will accept. That's why you never felt right with Marcus or Cain. That's why your wolf never rose for them. That's why your power rejected them before they could claim something that was never theirs." Ivory shook her head again, but weaker this time, fear and hope warring in her eyes. "But what if?" "There is no what if," Kristoff murmured, leaning closer but not touching her further, giving her every chance to pull back. "When a true mate bond exists, it pulls at both souls. Do you feel that pull toward me, Ivory? Because I feel it every time I breathe." His words struck something inside her, a tremor she'd been trying to ignore since the moment his eyes met hers. Her wolf had risen for him instantly, something that had never happened before, something she'd been too scared to acknowledge. Sterling stepped closer, his voice gentle but sure. "A true mate Omega doesn't harm her destined mate. The bond aligns, not rejects. Your power only acts defensively. If Kristoff were not meant for you, he wouldn't be standing right now. He would have collapsed the moment his wolf recognized the mismatch." Ivory swallowed hard, staring at her trembling hands in Kristoff's. Then why am I still so scared? Because you were hurt, Kristoff said, his thumb brushing away another tear. Your pack failed you. They didn't protect you. They didn't understand you. They let you believe you were broken when you were the rarest blessing in generations. Her breath caught. It felt like his words were peeling away armor she'd worn for years. Kristoff leaned in just enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. I will never pressure you. I will never ask for your mark until you're ready. You choose the moment. You choose the bond. You choose me, or you don't. His voice dropped lower, rougher. But I already chose you the moment I first saw you. Wolf and man both. Ivory's eyes lifted to his, full of fear, but for the first time, possibility too. If this bond is real, she whispered, if I'm really meant for you, then why did the goddess keep us apart for so long? Kristoff smiled, a small, aching thing full of reverence. Because you needed time to survive what was done to you. And I needed to be worthy of the queen she made for me. Ivory's breath trembled, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Kristoff. His other hand rose to cradle her face fully, his touch feather light. You will never lose me, Ivory. Not to a false bond. Not to your gift. Not to fate. His forehead touched hers, the contact sending a warm pulse through her entire body, her soul responding before her mind could. You're mine, he whispered, but the words were not a command. They were a promise. He told her about Rowan, the silent strategist she'd called Cloud, whose mind was sharper than any blade. About Hail, the one she'd named Mist, calm and steady as winter air. About Thorn, known to her as Storm, fierce in a fight but soft-spoken in every other moment. About Vale North, who never smiled but watched everything with unwavering loyalty. And the rest of them, each one exactly as she'd seen them in wolf form, their personalities unchanged by whether they wore fur or flesh. Ivory listened, slowly letting herself feel something she hadn't allowed in years, curiosity, connection, warmth. She found herself talking, too. Not about everything, not yet, but about her herbs, her grandmother's teachings, the animals she fed in the warmer months, the little patterns she carved into the handles of her tools when nights got too quiet. Kristoff would listen like every word she said mattered. The other seemed to respect the space he gave her, interacting with her gently, like she was something precious without being fragile. Every morning, Kristoff would bring her something small, a carved piece of driftwood polished smooth, a handful of wild berries he found under the snow, a flower frozen perfectly in ice. Courtship tokens, he'd call them with a teasing grin. Traditional ones come from the heart. She kept them all. Every night, he would sit by the fire with her, close but never touching unless she reached for him first. And when she did, he always froze for a heartbeat, as if it stunned him every time, before leaning into her hand, letting her bury her fingers in his hair or rest her palm against his cheek. He never rushed. Never pushed. Never demanded. And her wolf, who had been silent for years, began to stir. On the 8th morning, Ivory woke unexpectedly early. The cabin was quiet except for the soft breathing of the men sleeping wherever they'd found space the night before. Kristoff was sitting near the hearth, shirtless, his broad back turned toward her as he sharpened a hunting knife. The early sunlight spilled over him, catching the faint scars across his shoulders, the kind left by battle survived, responsibilities carried, burdens borne. Ivory didn't mean to stare, but something about that moment, him in her cabin, sunlight catching in his pale hair, the quiet confidence in every line of his body, made her breath catch. As if sensing her gaze, Kristoff turned slightly, his voice low and warm. Morning, Ivory. Something fluttered in her chest before she could smother it. She pulled her blanket closer around herself. You're up early. He smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. Wolves don't rest well when they're content. He paused, then added softly, or when their mate is stirring. Her cheeks warmed. I'm still not your mate. No, he agreed, setting the knife aside and turning fully toward her. Not yet. His eyes held hers with steady patience. But you haven't asked us to leave. You haven't pulled away from me. Your wolf hasn't rejected me. That's progress, Ivory. I don't need anything more than that. The gentleness in his voice shook her more than any declaration of fate. She tucked a strand of silver-white hair behind her ear, suddenly shy. "Kristoff, why are you trying so hard?" He rose, slow enough that she didn't flinch, and crouched in front of her, close but still giving her space. "Because you deserve a bond that doesn't hurt. Because the goddess chose you for me. Because the moment I saw you at that door, I felt something I've never felt in my life." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because I want you. All of you. Your past, your fear, your strength, your hope, even the pieces you still hide." Her breath shuddered out of her. "Let me earn you," Kristoff murmured. "Every day, every way. Not because the goddess says you're mine. Because you choose me." Ivory stared into those ice-blue eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel fear at all. She felt possibility. Ivory traced the ink with trembling fingers, her heart fluttering at the last line. "You're not alone anymore." No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever promised her anything beyond duty, fear, or avoidance. Kristoff's neat handwriting felt like a vow written directly across her soul. She sat down slowly, holding the note in both hands as if it might vanish if she loosened her grip. The cabin was warm, the fire banked just right, the stew giving off a comforting, savory scent. Everything was in place, neat, cared for, alive. They had left her safe. They trusted her to be here when they returned. She realized, with a jolt, that she trusted they would return too. Her wolf stretched inside her chest like it had been asleep for years. She moved through the cabin with a strange energy buzzing beneath her skin, doing chores she didn't need to do, tidying things that were already spotless, checking her herb jars for the 5th time. She tried reading, tried sewing, tried eating. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the snow-covered path where the men would appear when they came home. Hours dragged. The silence felt louder without their warm bodies, their subtle movements, their steady presence filling every corner of her small cabin. By late afternoon, Ivory went outside to gather more firewood, partly because she needed something to do, partly because being inside alone suddenly felt too empty. She bundled herself in layers, stepping into the glittering world of winter light. The snow was deep but the sun was bright, reflecting off the surface until everything looked like a field of diamonds. As she bent to pick up a fallen branch, she froze. Scent. Snow, cold metal, pine, and something darker beneath it. Not her pack. Not Kristoff. Not the elite guard. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. But the air was wrong, heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The hair on the back of her neck lifted. Ivory straightened and backed toward the cabin, every instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, to call for her wolves, her pack, but her voice stuck in her throat. A twig snapped. Then another. Then a low growl rolled across the clearing. Ivory's blood turned to ice. A wolf stepped out from between the trees. Then a second. Then 5 more. They weren't white. They weren't beautiful. They weren't hers. They were enormous, with dark fur and eyes glowing gold with feral hunger. Rogue wolves. She stumbled backward, breath catching. If Kristoff were here, if any of them were here, she wouldn't be afraid. But she was alone. Alone except. The snow behind her shifted, and Ivory whirled. Too late. A hand clamped over her mouth, an arm snatching her against a cold, unfamiliar chest. She tried to twist away, but the grip was iron, inescapable. A deep voice growled against her ear. "Hello, little Omega. You're exactly who we've been looking for." Her scream was swallowed by the hand over her mouth. Her wolf surged, desperate and terrified, but her body froze under the crushing grip. The rogues closed in, forming a circle. And all Ivory could think, as the world tilted sickeningly around her, was one horrifying truth. Kristoff had been right. She wasn't cursed. She was wanted, hunted. And whoever these wolves were, they hadn't come to claim her. They'd come to take her.
窗体顶端，窗体底端。
Ivory held the note to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks as emotions swelled inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in 3 long years, the weight of isolation had lifted. When they returned at sunset just like they promised, their arms full of supplies and their faces bright with excitement, she felt her heart ease in a way she hadn't thought possible. Kristoff swept her off her feet and spun her in a warm circle, his laughter brushing her ear. He asked if she'd missed them, and Ivory tried to play it cool, but the truth trembled in her voice. She had missed them more than she expected. The cabin had felt hollow without their presence. That night, Kristoff gently asked if he could sleep beside her instead of curling up on the floor in wolf form. He promised it would be only sleep, no pressure, just the comfort of holding her through the night. Ivory knew letting him in like that was risky, but she was tired of letting fear steal every chance at happiness. She told him yes, and the smile he gave her could have lit the darkness around them. He climbed into her small bed, drawing her close, his arms wrapping around her like she was something cherished. His scent wrapped around her, pine, frost, and something that was only Kristoff. His hand stroked her pale hair with a tenderness that made her chest ache. He whispered that he loved her, that he had loved her since the night she let them into her home despite being terrified. He loved the way she healed them, the way she sang softly while tending their wounds, the strength she carried even when she felt fragile. He vowed to spend his life proving himself worthy of her. Ivory wanted to say those words back, wanted to give him the truth blooming quietly inside her chest, but years of fear held the words hostage. She simply pressed closer, hoping the way she clung to him would speak for her. The days shifted into weeks. The elite guard took turns staying at the cabin while others returned to their camp, but Kristoff never left her side. He helped with chores, explained pack traditions, learned her routines, and moved through her life as though he'd always been part of it. Their rhythm was natural, steady, comforting. Her gift, always strong but unpredictable, responded to Kristoff's presence, sharpening and expanding in ways she had never experienced. She could sense injuries before she saw them, feel when a pack member needed help, understand what would ease their pain without being told. She knew exactly when River twisted his ankle during training and had him sit before he could make it worse. When Sterling developed a headache from hours of reading, she brewed the perfect tea for him without him uttering a single complaint. Kristoff watched her carefully one evening as the fire crackled between them, noting the way she moved, the way her awareness sharpened. He told her her gift was growing, that she was becoming the person she had always been meant to be. Ivory stared at her pale hands, turning them slowly in the warm glow. She remembered her grandmother saying her healing gift was the strongest she had ever seen, that the moon goddess had marked her pale so the world would recognize her purpose. A badge of honor, not a curse. But the pack had never seen it that way. Kristoff insisted her grandmother had been right, explaining that in the Northern Crown pack healers were honored above everyone except the Alpha and Luna. They were treasured, celebrated, essential. Hearing that loosened something deep in Ivory's heart, something tightly knotted for years. She hesitated before asking if he truly wanted her as his Luna, knowing she looked different, knowing she might never resemble a typical Omega. Kristoff turned to her and held her face gently, his eyes burning with certainty. He told her she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, comparing her hair to moonlight, her skin to fresh snow, her eyes to glacial ice. He said anyone who thought otherwise was blind and foolish. He wanted her exactly as she was, without changing a single thing. He wanted the pale Omega who lived alone in the mountains, healed wolves, and told awful cooking jokes. He wanted every part of her forever. Ivory kissed him before she could stop herself. She had wanted to for weeks, and his words broke through the last barrier she'd built around her heart. She kissed him with the weight of 3 years of loneliness, 3 years of feeling cursed and unwanted. Kristoff kissed her back with a tenderness so deep it almost unraveled her. His hands stayed on her face, steady and reverent, holding her as though she might break if he wasn't careful. He never pressed for more, never tried to take the kiss beyond what she offered. He simply kissed her like she mattered, like she was his entire world. When they finally pulled apart, breath mingling, Kristoff leaned his forehead against hers. He asked if this meant she believed him, if she was willing to try. Ivory admitted she was terrified of losing him, but she loved him too much to keep running. She said she would try, that she would go to his pack and see if they could make it work. Kristoff told her it would work, certain and unshakable, because she belonged to him and he belonged to her, and the moon goddess did not make mistakes. 3 days later, they prepared to leave for the Northern Crown Pack. Ivory packed her most precious belongings, her grandmother's healing journals, her medicine supplies, and a few carefully chosen pieces of clothing. Kristoff assured her they would send a team to collect the rest of her belongings and maintain her cabin for as long as she wished, a safe place she could always return to. But Ivory already knew she wouldn't go back. Whatever the future held, she could no longer imagine returning to solitude after finally knowing what it felt like to belong. The taste of connection had changed her forever. The journey took 5 days through narrow mountain passes and dense forest. The elite guard shifted into their wolf forms to carry the bulk of the supplies, their white coats bright against the dark evergreens. Kristoff remained in human form, walking beside Ivory and pointing out old landmarks, sharing stories from his childhood, explaining pieces of pack history with an ease that made her feel included. He held her hand almost the entire time, his warmth grounding her whenever nerves stirred. The Northern Crown Pack's territory was breathtaking. Their valley sat cradled between towering, snow-tipped peaks. A massive lodge of timber and stone rose at its center, majestic and sturdy as though it had grown naturally from the mountain's spine. Smaller cabins were scattered across the valley floor with thin trails of smoke curling from their chimneys. Wolves, both human and shifted, moved about the settlement, all of them pausing to stare as their Alpha King returned with an unfamiliar woman on his arm. Ivory's hand tightened around Kristoff's arm as they stepped into the main lodge. Hundreds of eyes tracked her, curious, assessing, some wide with shock at the sight of her pale coloring. Whispers rippled through the crowd. She felt the urge to flee rising in her chest. She wanted to disappear before anyone saw too clearly how strange she looked. But Kristoff pulled her firmly against his side, one arm wrapped protectively around her waist. He raised his voice, steady and commanding, echoing through the hall. He introduced her as Ivory, the pale Omega foretold in prophecy, the woman who had saved him and his elite guard in the blizzard, the one chosen by the moon goddess to be his Luna and their queen. He warned the pack that disrespect toward her was disrespect toward him and that harm toward her would be treated as a death sentence. He declared her under his protection and claim, and insisted she receive the honor of her position. A heavy silence followed his announcement, thick as winter fog. Then an older woman with silver hair stepped forward, her face lined but gentle. She said it was about time he found her, that Kristoff's mother had spoken of the pale Omega 2 decades earlier, predicting she would either strengthen the pack or destroy it. She said she saw the making of the prophecy in Ivory's eyes and welcomed her home as though she had always belonged. The woman's acceptance seemed to thaw the room. Pack members began approaching, offering introductions, greetings, and tentative smiles. Not all of them were immediately warm, and Ivory could still sense doubt in some gazes, but no one showed direct hostility. They were willing to judge her by her actions, at least. Kristoff led her away through a back corridor toward his private chambers within the lodge. The rooms were spacious and warm, with huge windows overlooking the valley and a massive bed layered with soft furs. Kristoff told her the space belonged to her as well now, and that if she preferred separate rooms he would arrange one immediately. If she wanted to share with him, he would be honored, whatever made her feel safe and comfortable. Ivory chose to share. She had grown accustomed to sleeping beside him, and the idea of being alone in an unfamiliar room unsettled her. The next weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment. Ivory had to learn the pack's hierarchy, customs, and political structure. She had to meet hundreds of wolves, committing their names and faces to memory. She had to grow used to the constant attention, the curious stares, the rumors quietly whispered whenever she passed. It was draining, overwhelming, and there were moments when she longed to flee back to her mountain cabin. But Kristoff walked beside her through every challenge. He introduced her to influential pack members, explained complicated traditions, helped her navigate unfamiliar social expectations. He defended her value whenever someone questioned it. He loved her openly and without hesitation, making it clear to the entire pack that she was cherished. Gradually, the pack began to warm to her. They watched her soothe children's injuries with her gentle touch. They saw her collaborate with Sterling to enhance their healing techniques. They observed how she treated everyone, whether high-ranking or not, with the same kindness. They saw the way Kristoff looked at her with fierce devotion, and how she returned that devotion with just as much depth. The elderly woman with silver hair, Sage, became Ivory's unofficial grandmother. She guided her through pack history and traditions, sharing stories of the Northern Crown and teaching her how to carry herself as future Luna. She told Ivory about Kristoff's mother and the prophecy that had shaped the pack for decades. She explained how Kristoff's mother had foreseen a pale Omega who would save her son and mend the wounds leadership had carved into him. She had known he would wait years to find Ivory, but also knew the wait would be worth it. Ivory blinked back tears as they worked in the healing lodge, wishing she could thank the woman who had seen her before she was even born. Sage assured her that the moon goddess had already carried Ivory's devotion to the woman's spirit, and that Kristoff's mother was grateful her son had found someone who loved him for himself, not his title. After 3 months in the Northern Crown Pack, Ivory finally felt rooted. She had friendships, responsibilities, and a purpose far bigger than mere survival. She ran the healing lodge alongside Sterling, training younger healers and managing the medicine stores with practiced confidence. She worked beside Kristoff on matters involving Omegas and often helped mediate disputes. She was becoming a true Luna even without being officially marked. But despite everything, the fear still lived inside her. Every time Kristoff looked at her with heat in his eyes, every time his touch lingered on her skin, every time their kisses left them breathless, the old terror rose up inside her. What if she was wrong? What if he wasn't really her true mate? What if she marked him and he died like the others had? Kristoff never pressured her. He seemed willing to wait forever if that was what she needed. But Ivory could see the silent weight it placed on him, the subtle questions in the pack's eyes about why their alpha still hadn't completed the bond. An unmarked Luna carried less authority, less respect. By holding back, she was holding him back. It was Sage who finally pushed her to confront the truth. The old woman spoke gently as they watched the sunset together, telling her she was letting fear rule her life again. She reminded Ivory that she had run to the mountains because she feared killing another mate, and now she was refusing to complete the bond for the same reason. Fear wasn't living, Sage said, it was just another kind of death. Ivory whispered her doubts, terrified that choosing wrong would cost Kristoff his life. Sage asked her what would happen if she was right, if she spent years afraid of a tragedy that would never come, if she denied them both the happiness they were meant to have because she couldn't trust the moon goddess. She reminded Ivory that Kristoff loved her more than his own life, and that he would rather risk everything to be her mate than live the rest of his days without her. Was she truly willing to make that decision for him? Ivory thought about Sage's words for 3 days. She watched Kristoff lead with strength, fairness, and compassion. She saw how deeply he cared for every member of his pack. She felt the steady, unwavering love he showed her every day. She remembered how he had waited weeks to kiss her, courting her with patience and tenderness. He was nothing like Marcus or Cain. They had been good men, but they had been wrong for her. They had loved her despite what they thought was a curse and had tried to push through it by force of will. Kristoff was different. He didn't believe she carried a curse at all. He saw her gift as something to honor. He believed the prophecy. He cherished her healing abilities because the pack needed them. He adored her pale features because they marked her as chosen, blessed, destined. He didn't fear her power, he respected it. And Ivory knew, deep in her bones and in the very center of her soul, that he was her true mate. The moon goddess had once guided 12 white wolves through a raging blizzard straight to her door, not only so she could save them, but so she could save him, and so they could save each other. When the full moon rose, Ivory stepped into Kristoff's chambers, wearing nothing except a silk robe. He looked up from the documents in his hands, and the moment his gaze landed on her, heat flooded his eyes. "Ivory," he whispered, setting the pages aside and rising slowly. "What's going on?" "I'm ready," she answered, her voice steady even though her heartbeat thundered in her chest. "I'm ready to complete our bond. I'm ready to be your Luna in every way. I'm ready to stop running from fear and start living." Kristoff crossed the room in 3 powerful strides, gathering her against him and kissing her with all the passion he'd kept restrained for so long. His fingers trembled as he loosened her robe, his touch equal parts reverent and hungry. "Are you absolutely certain?" he murmured. "We can wait if you need more time." "I'm certain," Ivory said with unwavering conviction. "I love you, Kristoff. I want to be yours completely. I want the world to know I'm your mate, your Luna, your queen. I want the bond that ties our souls together forever. I'm done being afraid." They came together slowly, deeply, with a gentleness that brought tears to Ivory's eyes. Kristoff cherished every curve of her pale skin, whispering how breathtaking she was, how perfect, how cherished. And when he finally joined with her, it felt like returning home, like discovering the missing piece of herself, like two halves of one soul merging again after too long apart. When the moment came for him to mark her, Kristoff hesitated, his teeth brushing her skin as though offering her a final escape. But Ivory tilted her head, giving him better access, and whispered, "I trust you. I trust what we are. I trust the moon goddess. Mark me." His teeth sank gently into her neck, and Ivory felt the bond snap into place. It was nothing like what she had endured with Marcus or Cain, no force, no resistance, no pain. This wasn't a false link between unwilling hearts. This was two spirits recognizing one another, welcoming one another, completing a story written long before either of them had lived. It was warm and certain and right. And Kristoff did not die. Afterward they lay together, Ivory resting against his chest, listening to the solid, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He was alive, strong, hers, and she was his. The curse, at last, had truly broken. "I told you," Kristoff murmured, his fingers slipping through her white hair. "The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes. You were always meant to be mine, and I was always meant to be yours. Nothing could change that. Not curses, not fear, not years apart. Our fate was decided long before we ever met." Ivory pressed a kiss over his heart, feeling its strength beneath her lips. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for loving me when I didn't know how to love myself." "Always," Kristoff vowed. "For the rest of our lives and everything beyond. You're mine, Ivory, my mate, my Luna, my queen, my entire world." Ivory stood in the middle of her now crowded cabin, confusion warring with calm. She should have been terrified, afraid of what would happen when the wolves shifted back to human form, but instead, a strange sense of rightness settled over her. 3 years of isolation had left her unused to companionship, yet watching these magnificent creatures relax, drifting towards sleep, she felt a missing piece of herself click into place. Exhausted, she banked the fire, wrapped herself in her warmest blanket, and climbed into her small bed in the corner. The Alpha, Frost, rose immediately and settled at her side, a warm barrier between her and the rest of the pack. She reached down and buried her fingers in his thick fur, marveling at its softness. The wolf made a rumbling sound of contentment and pressed closer to her touch. Ivory fell asleep there, hands still tangled in white fur, feeling safer than she had in 3 years. Morning light filtered through the ice-crusted windows, illuminating her unusual house guests. Most still slept, sprawled in ungainly yet majestic positions. Frost was awake, his ice-blue eyes observing her with intensity that somehow felt comforting. Ivory began breakfast, rationing her supplies carefully while feeding the 12 enormous wolves. They ate efficiently, almost like soldiers, and she watched them with fascination, their white fur thick and unblemished, eyes ranging from pale blue to deep sapphire. Even in the cramped cabin, they moved with coordinated grace, never colliding with one another or her. Days passed in this new rhythm. Ivory checked their wounds and was pleased to see them healing rapidly, a confirmation of their shifter nature. She spoke to them, sharing her grandmother's healing techniques, her herbs, and the strange peace of isolation. The wolves listened attentively, bringing her firewood, braving the storm to drag logs back, arranging themselves to conserve heat. Frost never left her side, protective and comforting. By the 3rd day, she had begun naming them in her head. The Alpha was Frost, the bonded pair Snow and Ice, 3 near the window Dawn, Mist, and Cloud. The others became Storm, Winter, North, Silver, Pale, and Ghost. Naming them was dangerous, attachment meant potential pain, but she could not stop herself. They were her only company, and through them, she felt less lonely than she had in years. On the 4th morning, the storm had passed, leaving 4 feet of snow outside. Her cabin was quiet and empty except for Frost, still watching her. Her heart clenched, expecting him to leave, but he did not scratch at the door. Instead, he sat facing it. Then the door swung open, revealing 12 men, naked and breathtaking, their eyes the same striking shades as their wolf forms. The man in front, the Alpha, stopped her breath. Platinum hair, ice-blue eyes, and a body carved from muscle. Kristoff. "My name is Kristoff, Alpha King of the Northern Crown Pack," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "You saved our lives when you could have left us to freeze. You healed us and asked nothing in return. By the laws of the Moon Goddess, I claim you as my intended mate, my Luna, my queen." Ivory shook, disbelief and fear warring inside her. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't be anyone's mate. I'll kill you." Kristoff knelt, gentle. "I know about your curse. I know what Marcus and Cain did. But you're not cursed, you're blessed. A true mate, Omega. Your soul rejects bonds that aren't meant to be. Marcus and Cain died because they weren't meant for you." Ivory's tears fell. "That's not possible." Sterling, the head healer, stepped forward. "True mate Omegas are rare. Most healers never see one. What you call a curse is actually protection, not death." Kristoff took her hands, warm and strong. "I've been searching for you 2 years. My mother, a seer, told me I would recognize you by your appearance and gift. You'd save me when I was at my weakest. We weren't caught in the blizzard by accident. The Moon Goddess led us to you." Ivory's fear battled hope. "What if you're wrong? Then don't mark me yet. Let me court you," he said, patient and unwavering. "Weeks, months, years, I'll wait forever if necessary." They dressed the elite guard in her grandmother's old clothes, and the following week became a blend of domesticity and careful courtship. Kristoff courted her with patience, telling her about his life, the pack, and his elite guard. Ivory told him her own story, her parents' deaths, her grandmother's upbringing, Marcus and Cain, and her years of isolation. Kristoff listened without judgment, always ready when she needed to speak. The elite guard treated her like she was already Luna, calling her my lady, and listening to her counsel. Ivory fell in love, not romantically with them, but as pack, learning personalities and quirks. Yet it was Kristoff who owned her heart, piece by piece. Weeks passed, and Ivory felt a sense of belonging she'd never known. She ran the healing lodge with Sterling, trained young healers, and mediated pack disputes. Fear still lingered. What if mocking Kristoff caused him harm? But Sage, the wise elder, reminded her, fear is just another kind of death. What if you deny yourself happiness for something that will never happen? Ivory considered this, reflecting on Kristoff's patience, his love, his respect, and his unwavering certainty. She knew he was her true mate. The Moon Goddess had led 12 white wolves to her cabin to save them, and to save him. On the night of the full moon, she went to Kristoff in a silk robe. "I'm ready," she said, steady despite her racing heart. "I'm ready to complete the bond." Kristoff crossed the room, kissing her with all the passion he'd held back for months. His hands reverent, his touch desperate yet gentle. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Ivory said firmly. "I love you. I want the bond that ties our souls together forever. I trust you." His teeth sank into her neck, and the bond snapped into place, warm, right, perfect. This wasn't forced or painful. It was completion, recognition, destiny fulfilled. They lay together, Ivory's head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Alive. Safe. Hers, and she his. 3 days later, under a full moon, the Northern Crown Pack gathered to witness their bond publicly. Ivory wore white fur and silk, platinum hair adorned with winter flowers. Kristoff mocked her in front of witnesses, completing the ceremony. The pack howled in celebration, a song of joy echoing through the valley and mountains. Years later, Ivory would tell young Omegas her story. 3 years alone in a mountain cabin, 12 white wolves scratching at her door, the Alpha who saw her blessing instead of her curse. Sometimes the right person comes when you've given up, When you think you're meant to be alone, she'd say. The moon goddess shows you were never cursed, you were just waiting for someone brave enough to see your blessing.